The restaurant was the kind of place my family loved: white tablecloths, soft gold lighting, waiters who refilled your water before you noticed it was low. Lorraine had chosen it, of course. She always chose places that made us look like more than we were. We were celebrating nothing in particular that night, just one of those dinners she organized to remind everyone that the Caldwells were doing fine. Thank you, better than fine. And I had come because I always came. That was my role. The one who showed up. I sat at the edge of the table, the way I always did, close enough to be present and far enough to be forgotten. Derek sat at the center, naturally, holding court with some story about a deal he'd almost closed, a car he was thinking about, a vacation he deserved. My mother watched him the way some people watch sunrises. My father nodded along, quiet, agreeable, a man who had spent 40 years agreeing. Then Lorraine raised her glass. I knew the toast was coming before she spoke, because she had that particular smile, the one she wore when she was about to say something cruel and dress it up as warmth. To my children, she said, sweeping her glass toward the table. Then her eyes settled on Derek and softened. To the one who finally has it together. The laughter started before she even finished. Light, easy laughter, the kind that doesn't think it's doing any harm. My aunt chuckled into her napkin. A cousin glanced at me sideways, waiting to see if I'd react. Derek lifted his own glass and grinned. Somebody had to carry the family name, he said, and the table laughed harder. I felt the heat climb up my neck, familiar as an old coat. I had felt it 100 times before, at holidays, at birthdays, at the dinner table when I was 9 and Derek was the prince and I was the help. The instinct to shrink was so practiced it didn't even feel like pain anymore. It felt like gravity. But I didn't shrink. I lifted my own water glass just slightly, and I smiled. A small, calm smile. I said nothing. And something about my silence made the laughter falter, just for a second, before someone changed the subject, and the moment passed. What none of them noticed was the envelope. It was in my bag, resting against my hip. A plain manila envelope I had carried into that restaurant the way you carry a thing you've waited years to set down. They thought they knew everything about me. They thought I was the daughter who tried and failed, the sister who never amounted to anything, the woman they could summon when a bill came due and dismiss when the meal was over. They thought the laughter was the end of the conversation. They had no idea it was the beginning. My name is Vanessa. I'm 38 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in a quiet house I bought with money one in that room knew I had. For most of my life, I was the failure of the Caldwell family. That wasn't an opinion. In my family, it was a fact, repeated so often and so casually that I had come to believe it myself for a long time. It started when I was 24. I had a small business back then, a little idea I poured everything into, and it closed within 2 years. It happens to most people who try. But in my family it didn't just happen, it became my identity. Vanessa, the one who failed. Vanessa, who should have known better. For 14 years, no one let that business die. They brought it up at dinners. They brought it up at weddings. My mother brought it up to strangers, lowering her voice as if confessing a tragedy. She tried, bless her heart. She'd say, and people would nod sympathetically at the daughter who couldn't. What they never asked was what I did after. That was the thing about my family, they never asked. They assumed. They had decided who I was a long time ago, and nothing I could do would have changed it, so at some point, I stopped trying to change it. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending the business that closed, stopped correcting the stories, stopped reaching for an approval that was never going to come. And I want you to understand something, because it took me years to understand it myself. My silence was never surrender. They thought it was. They mistook it for shame, for defeat, for a quiet kind of giving up. It wasn't. It was the quietest, most patient kind of strategy a wounded person can have. I let them keep believing the story they wanted to believe. And while they laughed, I built something they couldn't imagine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I need to stop for a moment, because I have a feeling some of you already know exactly how that table felt. Before I go on, I want to talk to you for a moment. The person listening to this right now. I don't know where you are. Maybe you're in your kitchen, or driving somewhere, or lying in bed with the lights off because this is the only quiet part of your day. Wherever you are, I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I read them. I really do, and when I can, I try to reply, because the people who find these stories usually found them for a reason. So let me ask you something, gently. How are you, really? Not the answer you give at work. The real one. And have you ever been the useful one in your family instead of the loved one? The one they call when something breaks, when a bill is due, when somebody needs a ride or a favor or a quiet check that no one talks about later, but never the one they call just to hear your voice. Have you ever loved people who only seem to remember you when they needed something? Have you ever had to walk away from people you were supposed to belong to and felt guilty for it, even though they were the ones who let you go first? If any of that lives in you, comment your country and tell me a little of your story. You'd be surprised how many people are sitting in the same ache, watching the same video, feeling a little less alone because you wrote a few honest words. And if this story is already starting to feel like your story, consider subscribing, because I tell these stories for people like us, the ones who were underestimated and learned to be quiet about it. Now let me take you back, because to understand that night at the restaurant, you have to understand the two people who built the room I grew up in. My brother Derek was the golden child. I don't say that bitterly, I say it the way you'd describe the weather, because in our house it was just the climate we lived in. Derek was charming. He had the kind of easy smile that made teachers forgive his late assignments and made our mother forgive everything else. When he won something, the whole family heard about it for months. When he failed at something, and he failed often, it was always someone else's fault, bad timing, a bad partner, a world that just didn't see his genius yet. He was praised for trying. I was blamed for the same trying. In public, Derek was the family's crown. In private, he was a man who had never once been told no. He borrowed money he never repaid. He made promises he never kept. And every single time, my mother smoothed it over, because to Lorraine, Derek's image was the family's image, and the family's image was the only thing she truly worshipped. My mother was the architect of all of it. Lorraine Caldwell cared about how things looked the way some people care about religion. The right house, the right clothes, the right story to tell the neighbors. She managed our family like a brand, and in that brand, everyone had a role. Derek was the success. My father was the agreeable backdrop. And I was the cautionary tale, the daughter whose failure made Derek's shine a little brighter by comparison. But here's what I understood even as a girl, long before I had words for it. I wasn't useless to them. I was deeply useful. I was the one who showed up early to set the table, and stayed late to clean it. I was the one who drove 3 hours when someone was sick. I was the one who quietly covered the gap when Derek's rent came up short, again, and was never thanked, because thanking me would have meant admitting I'd done something right. That was the contradiction I lived inside for years. To my mother, I was reliable but never remarkable. Necessary but never celebrated. The praise always flowed one direction, toward Derek, while the work always flowed the other, toward me. And for the longest time, I kept showing up anyway, hoping that if I was useful enough, patient enough, good enough, one day they would finally look at me the way they looked at him. I want to tell you the exact moment I stopped hoping for that. Because that moment, more than any other, is where this whole story really begins. It happened at a Thanksgiving, though it could have been any holiday, because they all followed the same script. I had driven in early, the way I always did, to help my mother in the kitchen. I'd spent the morning peeling, chopping, basting, setting the table she would later be complimented on. My hands smelled like onions and my back ached, and I didn't mind, because being needed was the closest thing to being wanted that I knew. Derek arrived late, empty-handed, an hour after the food was ready, and the room lit up like he was the one who'd cooked it. My mother stood and hugged him in the doorway, holding his face in her hands like she hadn't seen him in years. "There he is," she said, that warmth in her voice I had spent my whole life trying to earn. Then she glanced at me, still standing at the stove in her apron, and said, "Vanessa, honey, can you make him a plate? He's had a long drive." A long drive. He lived 20 minutes away. I made the plate. I always made the plate. But something in me went very still that afternoon, the kind of still that comes not from peace, but from finally seeing a thing clearly after years of squinting at it. I watched them laugh with Derek about nothing, watched my father nod along, watched the whole family orbit a man who had brought nothing to the table but himself, while I, who had brought everything, stood at the edge of it holding a serving spoon. And I finally understood the pattern, all the way down. It wasn't that they didn't love me because I failed. It was that my role required me to fail. I was useful precisely because I never threatened Derek's place. I was the one who gave and asked for nothing. And the moment I asked for something, even just to be seen, the warmth would close like a door. They didn't need a second success in the family. They needed a steady pair of hands and a quiet cautionary tale. And I had been auditioning for their approval in a role that was never going to change. I think about that Thanksgiving a lot, because it was the day I stopped being angry and started being awake. Anger had kept me coming back. Anger always wants a resolution, always believes that if it just explains itself well enough, the other person will finally understand. But you cannot explain yourself to people who need you to stay exactly as you are. I had spent 14 years trying to be understood by an audience that had already written my ending. So I made a decision that afternoon, standing at that stove. I decided to stop asking. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to picture some dramatic scene where I slammed a door or made a speech. There was no speech. That was never my way, and honestly, a speech would have given them something to talk about. Another story about Vanessa making things difficult. No, I simply finished the day, drove home, and made a quiet promise to myself in the dark of my car in the driveway. I was done seeking their approval. Done auditioning. Done explaining the business that failed and the life they assumed I was wasting. And I made a second promise, one I told no one. If I was going to be invisible to them anyway, then I would use that invisibility. I would build something of my own, quietly, completely outside their gaze. Not to prove them wrong, that's the part people get backwards. I didn't do it for revenge, not then. I did it because I finally understood that the only person who was ever going to bet on me was me, and I was tired of waiting for permission to do it. I didn't know what it would be yet. I just knew it would be mine. I had a little savings, a stubborn idea I'd been turning over for months about how small trucking companies were drowning in paperwork and bad software, and a kind of fearlessness that only comes after you've already failed once and survived it. The thing about being called a failure your whole life is that eventually you stop being afraid of failing. They had already given me their worst verdict. There was nothing left to lose. So I went home, and I opened my laptop and I started. No announcement. No family group text. No one to talk me out of it or tell me I should know better. Just me, a cheap desk, and the quietest beginning of something that would take 9 years to grow, and one evening at a white-clothed table to reveal. The first 2 years almost broke me, and no one knew, which somehow made it both harder and easier. Harder, because there was no one to catch me. Easier, because there was no one watching to say, "I told you so." I kept my regular job during the day, the steady, unremarkable one my family assumed was the ceiling of my ambition, and at night I became someone else entirely. I taught myself what I didn't know. I cold called trucking companies during my lunch breaks. I built the first clumsy version of the software at my kitchen table, fixing bugs at 2 in the morning, my eyes burning, my coffee cold. The idea was simple, which is usually how the good ones look once they work. Small freight and trucking outfits, the family-owned kind, were buried under paperwork, dispatch logs, fuel records, compliance forms, invoices that got lost between a clipboard and a glove box. The big software companies didn't care about them, too small to bother with, so I built something just for them. Plain, reliable. The kind of tool that didn't try to impress anyone, it just quietly made their day 20% less of a nightmare. My first client was a man named Earl, who ran 9 trucks out of a lot near Dayton. He signed up because I drove out there myself and sat in his cramped office and listened to him complain for an hour before I ever mentioned what I'd built. He paid me a small monthly fee and told 2 other owners about me, and those 2 told 2 more. That was the whole engine of it in the beginning. Not investors. Not a big launch. Just one tired business owner telling another that someone had finally built a thing that worked. And here's the detail that mattered most. The one that would change everything years later at that dinner table. When I registered the company, I didn't put my name anywhere near the front of it. I set it up under a neutral holding company with a plain, forgettable name, the kind of name that sounds like 100 other small firms in any business directory. It wasn't that I was hiding from the law. Everything was clean. Everything was filed properly. I was hiding from them. From my family. I knew, even then, that if Lorraine ever caught wind that Vanessa was running a business again, she would have found a way to be a part of it, to comment on it, to manage it, or to wait for it to fail so the story could be retold. I didn't want their voices anywhere near the one thing that was finally mine. So the company grew in the dark. While they laughed at the daughter who never amounted to anything, that daughter was signing her 10th client, then her 40th, then her 100th. While my mother told strangers I'd tried and failed, I was hiring my first 2 employees. The contrast was almost funny, if it hadn't taken so much out of me. To them, I was a woman standing still. In reality, I was running, every single night, in a direction they couldn't see. The person who first made me believe it could be more than survival was a bank manager named Marcus. I met him because the business had grown to the point where my finances were a tangle I couldn't manage out of a kitchen drawer anymore. And I walked into his branch one afternoon, expecting to be treated the way I usually was, like a small fish who'd wandered into the wrong pond. Marcus didn't do that. He looked at my numbers, the steady climb of them, the discipline of how I'd reinvested almost everything. And he looked at me, and he said something no one in my life had said in years. "You know what you've built here, don't you?" I didn't, not really. I'd been too deep in the daily grind to lift my head and see the shape of it. Marcus saw it before I did. He sat with me for 2 hours that first day, well past closing, walking me through how to structure the company properly, how to separate my personal finances from the business, how to think like the owner of something that was going to keep growing instead of someone just trying to keep the lights on. He didn't flatter me. He just believed me, which was different and rarer. Over the next few years, Marcus became the closest thing I had to a true ally. He helped me set up the accounts that would let the company scale. He introduced me to an estate attorney who would later structure a trust to protect everything I was building. He was the first person in a very long time who treated me as capable, not as a project, not as a disappointment, not as a useful pair of hands, just as a woman who was good at something and deserved to be taken seriously. I remember driving home from the bank that first night, and for the first time in years I cried, not from sadness, but from the strange ache of being seen. I had spent my whole life waiting for my family to look at me like Marcus had looked at me across that desk. A stranger had given me, in 2 hours, what they'd withheld for 38 years. I didn't know it yet, but the company would keep climbing, year after quiet year, past numbers I never let myself dream about out loud. And I had no idea that one day soon, the same family that couldn't see me would call, not to apologize, not to ask how I was, but because they needed something only the daughter they'd written off could give them. The phone call came on an ordinary Tuesday, 9 years into the life they knew nothing about. I almost didn't answer. My mother's name on the screen usually meant a task was coming, a holiday to host, a problem to absorb. But I answered, the way I always had, because some habits outlive the reasons we formed them. She didn't ask how I was. She never did. She got there in about 4 sentences, the way she always circled to the point once the pleasantries were out of the way. There was a situation, she said, and the word sat heavy in her mouth. Derek was in trouble. Real trouble this time, not the usual kind. He'd made some investments that went bad, signed things he shouldn't have, and now there were debts, serious ones, the kind that don't go away with a charming smile. And it had spread, somehow, to my parents, who had co-signed and lent and quietly mortgaged pieces of their own security to keep their son afloat, the way they always had. We're family, my mother said, and I could hear the old machinery turning, the guilt she'd oiled and used my whole life. Family helps family, Vanessa. After everything we've done for you. After everything they'd done for me. I let that sit for a moment in the silence between us. I thought about the plates I'd made, the holidays I'd cleaned up after, the money I'd quietly given Derek years ago and never seen again. I thought about a lifetime of being the one who helped, summoned now, once more, 'cause a bill had come due. But here's what struck me most, listening to her. She still had no idea. In her mind, she was calling her failed daughter, the one with the modest job and the small life, asking her to scrape together whatever she could to help. She wasn't calling a woman who could have settled the entire debt with a single afternoon's paperwork and never felt it. She was asking the cautionary tale for a loan. The contrast was so absurd I almost laughed and almost cried, because even now, even desperate, it never once occurred to her that I might have made something of myself. The story she told for 14 years was that complete in her own mind. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it, which was not an answer she was used to hearing from me, and I could feel her bristle at it through the phone. That little catch of surprise that useful Vanessa, had not immediately reached for her checkbook. What I felt, sitting there after she hung up, was not anger. I'd burned through the anger years ago at that stove. What I felt was a cold, clear curiosity, almost a calm, because I understood, finally and completely, what I had always been to them. Not a daughter, not a sister, a resource. And resources get called when the well runs dry, not when there's something to celebrate. A few days later, the second call came, and this one was the trap, though they didn't think of it that way. My mother's voice was honey again, the desperation tucked back behind the brand. They were hosting a dinner, she said, a real one, to mark her and my father's 40th anniversary. Everyone would be there, the aunts, the cousins, the whole extended audience. And she wanted me there, she said, with a warmth she hadn't aimed at me in years. It was time, she said, to come together as a family. I knew exactly what it was. I had watched Lorraine work a room my entire life. The anniversary was real, but the choreography around it was not. They would gather everyone, soften me with the occasion and the witnesses, and then, somewhere between the toasts and the dessert, the conversation would turn, gently at first, toward Derek's troubles and my responsibility to help. In front of the whole family, where saying no would make me the villain, the selfish one, the daughter who turned her back on her parents in their hour of need. It was Lorraine's favorite kind of leverage. Public pressure dressed up as love. I should have felt cornered. For most of my life I would have. The old Vanessa would have spent the week dreading it, rehearsing apologies, already reaching for the checkbook in her mind. But I wasn't her anymore. I said yes. Calmly, easily, with a warmth of my own that probably unsettled my mother more than refusal would have. Of course, I told her. I wouldn't miss it. And I meant it, though not for the reasons she thought. Because somewhere in that second phone call, listening to her lay out her little trap, I'd made a decision. I was going to walk into that dinner. I was going to let them set the stage exactly as they'd planned it. And then, for the first time in 38 years, I was going to let them see who I actually was. There was just one thing left to prepare. And the next morning, I called Marcus. Marcus listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked the only question that mattered. What do you actually want to walk out of that room with, Vanessa? Not what do you want to prove. What do you want to keep? It was the right question, and it reframed everything. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want to humiliate them for sport, no matter how much 14 years of being the family joke might have earned me the right to. What I wanted was simpler and harder. I wanted the truth on the table, undeniable, in front of the same audience that had laughed at me, and I wanted to walk out with my dignity and my company intact, and the door to being exploited closed for good. I didn't need to shout, I just needed the truth to be impossible to argue with. So we prepared the way you prepare for anything that matters. Quietly, thoroughly, with documents instead of emotion. Over the following week, Marcus and the estate attorney helped me gather everything into a single clean record. The ownership filings that showed, in plain legal language, that the holding company my family had vaguely heard of, the one a few of them actually respected from the business pages, was mine. The bank statements showing 9 years of steady, disciplined growth. The trust the attorney had structured to protect it all. And the valuation, the number that still felt strange to say out loud even to myself. $7 million. I want to be honest with you about that number, because the audience for a story like mine is sharp, and you'd catch me if I lied. 7 million was the value of this company, what the business itself was worth as an asset, built from equity and steady revenue over 9 years. It wasn't $7 million sitting in a checking account. I lived modestly. I'd reinvested almost everything. But the thing I had built, the company with my name buried in its filings, was worth that, and the documents proved it cleanly, and that was the truth I was going to set on the table. The attorney was careful with me, the way good professionals are. She made sure I understood that I had no legal obligation to pay a single cent of Derek's debts or my parents', that adult children don't inherit their relatives' bad decisions, that co-signing was something ours they had chosen and could not be transferred to me by guilt. She helped me think through what, if anything, I might actually be willing to do, and how to structure it so I was never again a bottomless well someone could reach into. I wasn't planning to abandon my parents entirely. But whatever I did would be on my terms, in writing, and never through Derek. I assembled it all into a plain manila envelope. Not a binder, not a folder with my company's logo, nothing that announced itself. Just an ordinary envelope, the kind that wouldn't draw a second glance, sitting in a bag beside a dinner table. There was something fitting about that. For 9 years I had hidden in plain sight, an unremarkable woman carrying an unremarkable life. The envelope matched the disguise. What was inside would not. By the end of that week, I was ready. The proof was ready. And then, the night before the dinner, something I hadn't planned for happened. I lost my nerve. It came on me late in the evening, sitting alone in my quiet house with that envelope on the counter. All my calm strategy dissolved, and underneath it I found a much older, much smaller feeling, the little girl who had set the table, and made the plate, and waited her whole life to be loved instead of used. Part of me, the part I'm not proud of, still wanted them to be proud of me, still wanted my mother to look at those documents and finally say the words I'd been starving for. And I knew, even as I wanted it, that she never would. That walking into that room wouldn't give me my family back. It would only give me the truth, and the freedom that comes after it, and those are not the same thing as love. I picked up the phone and called the people who had become my real family. A close friend who had stood by me through the worst of the building years, and Marcus's wife, who had folded me into their holidays when my own had grown too painful to attend. I didn't even have to explain much, they knew. And what they said to me, in different words, was the same thing. Frey, you don't owe them your silence anymore. And whatever happens in that room, you have people who already see you. You're not walking in alone, and you're not walking out alone either. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. And slowly, the little girl quieted, not because the wound had healed, it hadn't, not yet, but because for the first time I could hold her and still do the hard thing anyway. I put the envelope in my bag. I laid out my clothes for the next evening, nothing flashy, nothing that announced anything. And I went to bed steadier than I'd been in years, because I finally understood that I wasn't going to that dinner to win their love. I was going to stop needing it. The restaurant was the same kind of place I described to you at the very start: white tablecloths, gold light, waiters gliding between tables like they were part of the decor. Lorraine had outdone herself for the anniversary. A long table near the back, flowers she'd chosen to photograph well, a printed little card at each setting because she could never resist a touch that made the evening look more important than it was. The whole extended family was there, the aunts who'd chuckled at me my entire life, the cousins who'd learned from them, my father at the head of the table, looking faintly overwhelmed by the occasion. The way he always looked overwhelmed by anything Lorraine arranged. They greeted me when I walked in, and I want you to notice the shape of that greeting, because it told me everything before a single course was served. There was warmth, but it was the warmth you'd show a contractor you needed to stay on good terms with. My mother kissed the air beside my cheek and told me I looked tired, which was her way of reminding the table, gently, of the hard little life she imagined I led. An aunt asked if I was still doing that office job, with the particular pity people reserve for someone they've decided to feel sorry for. And then, naturally, they seated me at the edge. Same as always. Close enough to be present, far enough to be forgotten. I let them. I sat where they put me. I smiled, I complimented the flowers, I asked my father about his garden, and all the while I was watching, the way I'd learned to watch over a lifetime of being overlooked. Being invisible teaches you to see, and what I saw that night, underneath the performance, was fear. It was in Derek first. He was doing his usual thing, the loud stories, the easy laugh, the center of the room charm, but it was running too fast, like an engine with something wrong in it. His jokes landed a half beat early. He drank quicker than he should have. There was a brittleness under the gloss, the look of a man whose whole life is held together with charm, and who has just felt the charm start to fail. I'd never seen Derek afraid before. I'd never seen him need anything he couldn't smile his way into. That night, he needed something badly, and it had made him fragile in a way the rest of the table was too used to him to notice. And it was in my parents too, in the careful way they avoided certain subjects, in the glances that passed between Lorraine and my father when they thought no one was looking. The flowers and the printed cards and the expensive restaurant, I realized, were not signs of how well they were doing. They were the opposite. They were the brand working overtime to hide the cracks. People who are truly fine don't try this hard to look at. My mother had spent money she probably didn't have to stage an evening designed to convince everyone, including herself, that the Caldwells were thriving, and the centerpiece of that evening, the quiet pivot the whole thing was built around, was going to be me. I felt strangely calm watching it all. Not cold, just steady, the way you feel when you've stopped waiting for a thing to happen and have simply decided to be ready when it does. The envelope sat in my bag against my hip, exactly where it had sat at that first dinner I told you about, only this time I knew I was going to open it. The dinner moved through its early acts the way Lorraine had surely scripted. Drinks, then the appetizers, then a round of toasts where she stood and spoke beautifully about 40 years of marriage and family, and sticking together through everything. Her eyes, finding mine a beat too long on that last word. The aunts dabbed at their eyes. Derek raised his glass and said something charming. My father nodded. It was lovely, and it was a performance, and I was the only one at the table who could see both at once. Then the plates were cleared, and the coffee came, and the air shifted. I felt it before anyone said a word. That small change in the room's pressure when the real business of an evening is about to begin. My mother set down her cup. She glanced at Derek. Derek glanced back. And she turned toward me with that smile. The warm one, the dangerous one, the one I had been watching her wear my whole life right before she said something that was about to cost someone else. Vanessa, she said sweetly, loud enough for the whole table to hear. We've actually been wanting to talk to you about something. As a family. And just like that, the trap I'd seen coming for 2 weeks swung gently, lovingly shut. Every face at that table turned toward me. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone already knows the script and is waiting only to watch you play your part. So I folded my hands in my lap, and I looked back at her, and I waited to hear them say it out loud. Of course, I said. What is it? My mother glanced once more at Derek, a handoff, and he leaned forward into the opening with the ease of a man who'd been rescued his whole life, and had no reason to expect this time would be different. He smiled at me, that practiced smile, and pitched his voice to Carrie because Derek never said anything important without an audience. Look, Vanessa, he said, we know things have always been, tight for you. And nobody's judging that, okay? But the family's going through a rough patch right now, and the thing about family is everybody pitches in what they can. So we were thinking, even something small from you would mean a lot. It's about showing up. It's about finally, and here he let the smile widen, playing to the aunts. Contributing. A few of them chuckled. Soft, knowing laughter, the same laughter from that first dinner, the kind that doesn't think it's cruel. The cousin across from me glanced my way to see if I'd shrink. My mother watched me with that warm, expectant pressure, certain she already knew how this ended, with useful Vanessa reaching, apologizing, scraping together whatever the failure could manage and being grateful for the chance to belong. I let them finish. That was the thing they never expected, my stillness. I didn't rush to fill the silence the way I used to. I let Derek's words hang in the gold light until the chuckling trailed off and the table started, just slightly, to wonder why I wasn't reacting. Then I said, quietly, can I ask you something first? Of course, honey, my mother said. Why do you all assume I have nothing? The question landed strangely, because no one had ever heard me ask it. Derek actually laughed. Come on, Van, he said, slipping into the old nickname like a knife. We're not trying to embarrass you. We all remember the little business. We're just saying whatever you've got, it helps. No one expects much. The little business. 14 years old, that wound, and he reached for it as easily as breathing. A couple of the aunts smiled into their coffee. And I understood, watching them enjoy it, that they needed this. They needed me small. The whole evening, the Holes family, was built on the quiet certainty that I would always be the one with nothing to offer but my hands and my apologies. I see, I said. And I felt the last of the old longing go quiet inside me, the little girl finally setting down the plate. For most of my life, I've explained myself to this family. I explained why the business closed. I explained what I was doing, what I was trying. And none of you ever once listened, because you'd already decided who I was. I looked around the table, unhurried, meeting each pair of eyes. So a long time ago, I stopped explaining myself. The smiles began to falter, not because they understood yet, but because my voice was wrong for the part they'd cast me in. Too calm. Too certain. My mother's expression tightened at the edges. But you brought me here to talk as a family, I went on. So let me show you something instead. And then I reached down into my bag, and I took out the plain manila envelope, and I set it on the white tablecloth in the center of the table, beside the flowers Lorraine had chosen to photograph well. For a moment no one moved. Derek's eyes flicked to it, then back to me, the smile still on his mouth but no longer reaching anywhere. "What's that?" he said. "Open it?" I said. He didn't. My mother didn't. There's a kind of person who senses a turn coming and freezes rather than meet it, and the whole table had gone into that freeze. So I reached over myself, unhurried, and slid the first document out, and turned it to face them. It was the ownership filing, the holding company. The neutral, forgettable name that 2 or 3 people at that table actually recognized, because it had been in the regional business pages, because it was a company people respected, a quiet local success story none of them had ever once connected to the daughter they pitied. I watched the recognition move across my uncle's face first. He owned a small contracting outfit. He knew the name. He frowned, read it again, and looked up at me with something I had never, in 38 years, seen any of them aim at me. Confusion. And underneath it, the first cold edge of doubt about everything they thought they knew. That company, my uncle said slowly. That's Vanessa, that's a real company. That's a serious operation. Yes, I said. It is. My mother let out a short, sharp laugh, the brand snapping back into place. Vanessa, what is this? Some kind of joke? You don't. She gestured at the paper as if it were absurd, as if the very idea offended the story she'd told for 14 years. You don't own something like that. I didn't argue. Arguing was the old way, the way that had never worked. I just slid the filing a few inches closer to her, so she could read the line where the owner was named. And the laughter died in her throat. She read it once. Then she read it again, her lips moving slightly, the way people do when the words on a page refuse to mean what they expect. The owner of record. The holding company. And my name, the legal owner, in plain black type that didn't care about 14 years of family mythology. That's, she started, and stopped. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, I said gently. You just never asked. And then I did the thing I'd come to do. Not in a rush, not with a flourish, but one document at a time, the way Marcus had taught me, because the truth lands hardest when it arrives slowly enough to be understood. I drew out the next page and laid it down. The bank statements, 9 years of them in summary, a line that started small and climbed and didn't stop. I laid down the formation records that showed when I'd started, that quiet year right after the Thanksgiving I'd stood at the stove and made a promise to myself. I laid down the documents showing the employees, the clients, the contracts. And then I laid down the last one. The valuation. I didn't say the number. I didn't have to. It was printed there, certified, impossible to wave away as one of Vanessa's stories. $7 million. The worth of the thing I had built in the dark while they laughed in the light. The table went silent. Not the polite silence from before, not the waiting for, the script silence, but the real kind, the kind that falls over a room when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that the ground they were standing on was never there. An aunt set down her coffee cup without a sound. The cousin who'd glanced at me to watch me shrink was staring at the papers with her mouth slightly open. My father had gone very still at the head of the table, reading the valuation over and over. I watched Derek's face drain. I'd never seen it happen to him before, the charm just emptying out, leaving something young and frightened underneath. Because Derek understood faster than the others what this meant. Not just that I had money, but that the entire structure of our family, the one where he was the success and I was the cautionary tale, had just collapsed in front of every person whose opinion he'd built his identity on. The crown he'd worn his whole life had never been real, and everyone at that table was watching it come off. My mother's hand was trembling slightly where it rested on the tablecloth. The brand, the thing she'd spent 40 years protecting, was failing in real time, in front of her whole audience. And she couldn't stop it. Why, she said, and her voice had lost all its honey, why would you hide this? From your own family? For years? It was a remarkable question when you sat with it. Not congratulations. Not I'm sorry we were wrong about you. Her first instinct, even now, was that I had done something to her by succeeding quietly. As if my hiding it were the betrayal, and not the 14 years that had made hiding it necessary. You know why, I said. And I think, for just a second, she did. Then the room shifted again, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to, because it told the truth louder than any document on that table. The fear and the shock began, almost instantly, to reshape themselves into something else. into opportunity. It was Derek who broke first, because Derek had never in his life been able to sit in a feeling without trying to sell his way out of it. The color came back into his face. And the smile came back too, a different smile now, eager, reaching. Van, he said, leaning toward me, my God, this is incredible. This is amazing. I always knew you had it in you. I said that. Didn't I always say Vanessa was the smart one? He laughed, and looked around for agreement that didn't come. Listen, this is perfect timing, honestly, because what I'm working on right now, with the right partner, with a little backing. And there it was, the pivot. Not 3 minutes after he'd mocked my little business, he was pitching me on funding his. And my mother, recovering, found her footing in the same direction. The warmth came flooding back into her voice, but aimed differently now, the way warmth flows toward something useful. We are so proud of you, she said, and the aunts nodded quickly, eagerly, suddenly remembering they'd always believed in me. This is wonderful, sweetheart. And you see, this is exactly what family is for. We can finally take care of each other. With what you have, the things we could do, we could fix everything. We always believed in you. An aunt offered. That business closing, that was just a setback. Anyone could see you'd bounce back, said another, who had told the closing story at 3 separate weddings. I sat very still and let them do it. Let them rewrite out loud, in real time, 14 years of contempt into 14 years of secret faith. Let them reach for my 7 million with the same hands that had pushed me to the edge of the table, not 20 minutes earlier. It was the most honest thing they'd ever shown me, and they had no idea they were showing it. The mockery and the sudden love came from the exact same place. I had never been a daughter to them. I had only ever been a resource, and the only thing that had changed was the size of the resource. And I realized, sitting in the middle of all that scrambling warmth, that I felt no triumph. I'd thought I might. I'd thought the reveal would feel like winning. Instead it felt like watching a door finally close that I'd been holding open my whole life with my own tired hands. My mother was still talking, still painting the beautiful future where my money fixed their problems and we were all a family at last. And when she paused, expecting me to fold into it the way I always had, I set my coffee down, and I said the thing I had really come there to say. I want to tell you what I heard tonight, I said. All of you. Just for a minute, and then I'll answer. The table quieted. My mother's smile held, but it had gone uncertain at the corners. 20 minutes ago, I said, before any of you knew what was in that envelope, you sat me at the edge of this table the way you always have. You asked if I was still doing that office job. You told me I looked tired. And then my brother, in front of everyone, asked me to finally contribute, and you laughed. You laughed, because the idea that I might have something to offer was funny to you. That's who I was to this family right up until the moment you saw a number on a page. No one spoke. The aunts had stopped nodding. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I said, and I meant it. I'm telling you because I want you to hear how fast it changed. The second you understood I had money, you loved me. Derek had a pitch before the shock wore off. Mom, you told me you were proud of me, and you've never once said that to me sober and meaning it in 38 years. I turned to the aunt on my left. You've told the story of my business closing at 3 weddings. I was there for 2 of them. She looked down at her plate. I wasn't shouting. I want you to understand that, because it's the part that mattered. I had spent my whole life believing that if I just explained myself loudly enough, with enough feeling, they would finally understand. But you don't have to raise your voice when the truth is sitting in a manila envelope in the middle of the table. I just said it plainly, naming the moments, one after another, the plates and the holidays, and the money lent to Derek and never returned, the rides, the favors, the lifetime of being the useful one and never the loved one. And as I named them, the relatives who had laughed an hour ago couldn't meet my eyes. The room that had been built to humiliate me had, without my raising a hand, turned its shame back on itself. My father spoke then, for almost the first time all night. Vanessa, he said quietly, we didn't realize, and he couldn't finish it, because there was no honest way to finish it. We didn't realize was its own confession. They hadn't realized because they had never looked. I know, I said, and there was no cruelty in it. Just truth. Then my mother gathered herself, because Lorraine always gathered herself, and she reached for the only tool she had left. We are still your family, she said, and the warmth was back, thick now almost pleading. Whatever we did wrong, we can fix it. But you can't sit there with all of that and watch your own parents drown. Your brother is in real trouble. We could lose the house. You have the means to make this all go away, and family, as real family, doesn't turn its back. So I'm asking you, what are you going to do? There it was, the question the whole evening had been built around. And every face turned to me, waiting, the way they'd waited my entire life for me to give and apologize for not giving more. Here's what I'm going to do, I said. I let it sit a moment. Nothing for Derek. Not a dollar. Not now, not ever. He is a grown man who has spent his whole life being rescued, and every rescue has only taught him there's no bottom. I'm not going to be the next pair of hands that keeps him from ever once facing what he's done. Derek started to speak, and I looked at him, and for the first time in our lives he stopped. You called my work a little business an hour ago. You don't get to call it your investment fund tonight. I turned to my parents. Mum, Dad, I'm not going to let you lose your home. But I'm not handing anyone a check at a dinner table, and I'm never again going to be the well this family reaches into whenever someone's thirsty. I kept my voice even. If you want help, it will go through my attorney. It will be structured, and it will be in writing, and it will go directly to the mortgage or the creditor, never to Derek, never through Derek, never to be passed along to Derek. You'll know the exact terms before you agree to anything. That's the only door I'm leaving open. Take it or don't. It was a fair offer. It was, honestly, more than they deserved, and more than the attorney had thought I'd give. But it came with no apology and no power for Lorraine to manage, and that, I understood, was unbearable to her. She stood up. The brand cracked completely, and what came out from behind it was the thing that had run our family for 40 years. After everything we did for you, she said, her voice rising, the whole restaurant beginning to glance over, you would humiliate us here tonight on our anniversary with your as money, like you're better than this family, like you're better than your own mother. I didn't rise to it. I'd spent a lifetime learning not to. I just looked at her, calm in the middle of her storm, and the contrast between us was its own kind of answer, her panic, my stillness, in front of everyone she had ever performed for. No, Mom? I said softly. I don't think I'm better than you. I just stopped believing I was worth less. And I reached across the table, gathered my documents back into the plain envelope, and put it away. I left before dessert. There was a strange dignity in that, in standing, thanking my father quietly for nothing in particular, and walking out through the gold light with the envelope back in my bag, and my mother still standing at the table, her storm with nowhere left to go. No one followed me. I think they were too stunned, the family that had laughed at the start of every dinner I'd ever attended, sitting now in a silence they didn't know how to perform their way out of. I drove home that night with the windows down, and I noticed, somewhere on the highway, that I was breathing differently, deeper. Like a person who had just set down something they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it had weight. The fallout came quickly, and it came mostly without me. That was the part I hadn't expected, that I wouldn't have to do anything at all. The truth, once it's loose in a room full of witnesses, does its own work. Within days, the family was talking, the way families like mine always talk, in phone calls and side conversations and carefully worded messages. But the story had changed, and Lorraine could no longer control the telling of it, because too many people had been at that table. The narrative she'd spent 14 years building, the failed daughter and the golden son, had collapsed in front of the entire audience it was performed for, and there was no putting it back together. People had seen the valuation. They'd seen Derek pivot from mockery to begging in under 3 minutes. They'd seen my mother's warmth switch on the instant a number appeared. You can't unsee a thing like that. Derek's troubles, without me to absorb them, surfaced into the open the way they were always going to. The debts were real, and the charm that had carried him his whole life turned out to be very poor currency with creditors. Relatives who might once have quietly helped him now hesitated, because they'd watched him at that dinner. And something about seeing a man mock his sister, and then reach for her money in the same breath had curdled their sympathy. For the first time in his life, Derek had to sit in the full weight of what he'd done, with no one rushing in to lift it off him. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching that from a distance. He was still my brother. But I had learned, finally, that letting someone face the consequences of their own choices is not cruelty. Sometimes it's the only honest gift you have left to give them. My parents took the door I'd left open. It wasn't warm, and it wasn't a reconciliation, but a few weeks later my father called my attorney, and we structured exactly what I'd said we would, help that went directly to the mortgage, in writing, on terms, with Derek's name nowhere near it. My mother never thanked me. I hadn't expected her to. But the house was safe, and I had done it without ever again becoming the well. And there was a quiet peace in that, in being generous and bounded at the same time, in proving to myself that I could give without disappearing. And then something happened that I truly hadn't seen coming. The relatives began to reach out. Not all of them, but some: the uncle who'd recognized the company name, a cousin, the aunt who'd told the closing story at 3 weddings and couldn't look at me by the end of that dinner. They called, awkwardly, to say things they didn't quite have the words for. We didn't know. We're sorry. We should have seen you. A few of them said it plainly, that they'd watched how the family treated me for years and told themselves it wasn't their business, and that the dinner had shamed them into honesty. I didn't need their apologies the way I once would have. But I accepted them, because people who are willing to admit they were wrong are rare, and I'd spent enough of my life being the one who admitted things alone. The strangest part of all of it was how light I felt. I kept waiting for the triumph to fade into emptiness, the way revenge is supposed to in the stories. But it wasn't revenge, that was the thing. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I'd simply stopped holding the door open with my own tired hands and let it swing shut on its own, and the relief of that wasn't bitter at all. It was just quiet. For the first time in 38 years, I wasn't bracing for the next phone call, the next task, the next casual humiliation dressed up as family. The bracing had become so much a part of me that I hadn't known it was there until it was gone. I started seeing a therapist around then, which I'll admit I'd resisted for years, because the useful one in any family learns early that her job is to manage everyone else's pain and never name her own. But sitting in that office, I finally said it out loud, all of it: the plates and the stove, and the little girl who waited her whole life to be loved instead of used. And saying it out loud, to someone who simply listened, did something the 7 million never could have. The money had proven my worth to them. Naming the wound began to prove it to me. And those, I was learning, were 2 completely different kinds of freedom, and only one of them lasts. The life I built after that, the real one, the one that has nothing to do with a number on evaluation, looks nothing like the life my family imagined for me, and nothing like the life I'd been chasing either. I stopped organizing my year around their holidays. I stopped waiting for the call that would finally come with warmth in it instead of a request. And into the space that left, slowly, the people who had actually seen me all along moved in and filled it. Marcus and his wife became something like the family I'd lost, or maybe the family I'd never really had to begin with. I spend holidays at their table now, the kind of table where someone asks how you actually are and waits for the real answer. My closest friend, the one who'd talked me off the ledge the night before that dinner, is the person I call first now, with good news and bad, and she calls me the same way. This is what no one tells you about chosen family, that it isn't a consolation prize for the family you were born into. Sometimes it's the thing you were always supposed to have, finally arriving once you stop blocking the doorway with people who were never going to walk through it. I started mentoring, too, which surprised me. Young women trying to build something out of an idea and a cheap desk and too little sleep, the way I once did. I tell them the practical things: how to structure a company, how to protect what they build, the lessons Marcus gave me across that desk years ago. But mostly I tell them the other thing, the thing that took me 38 years to learn: that the people who underestimate you are not a problem to be solved. You will never argue them into seeing you. You don't build the thing to prove them wrong. You build it because it's yours, and then you let your life be the quiet answer to a question they were never honest enough to ask. People ask me sometimes if I've forgiven my family. It's a harder question than it sounds, and I want to answer it honestly for you, because I think some of you are sitting with the same one. I haven't reconciled with them, not really. My mother and I speak rarely and carefully. Derek and I don't speak at all, and I've made peace with the possibility that we never will. But forgiveness, I've come to believe, isn't the same as reopening the door. Forgiveness, for me, was the day I stopped letting their judgment live rent free in my chest. It was setting down the resentment, not for their sake, but because I was tired of carrying something that only ever weighed on me. You can release the grip of what someone did to you and still keep the boundary that protects you from them doing it again. I used to think those two things were in conflict. They're not. They're the same act of self-respect, just pointed in two directions. So that's my story. The daughter they laughed at, who sat at the edge of the table and built something in the dark they couldn't imagine, and who walked out of that restaurant not with revenge, but with something far better, herself. And before I go, I want to come back to you, the person who's been with me through all of it. Wherever you are tonight, I want you to hear this, because I think you might be someone who needed to. Your worth was never going to be decided by the people who only valued what they could take from you. It isn't measured in what you built, or what you earn, or whether anyone ever finally claps for you. You don't have to become a $7 million success to deserve to be loved instead of used. You only have to stop believing the story the wrong people told about you and start telling a truer one. If you've ever been the useful one instead of the loved one, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me your story, the real one. I read them, and I sit with them, and I answer when I can, because the people who find their way to a story like this almost always have a story of their own worth hearing. And if any part of mine felt like yours tonight, stay with me, subscribe, and come back, because there are more of us than you think, and you were never as alone as they made you feel. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourself. And don't let anyone tell you what you're worth ever again.